Every day, 42 million people walk through Central Park. They run on its paths. They picnic on its grass. They row on its lake. They do not know what is underneath their feet, not literally, not some buried secret, just a neighborhood, a real neighborhood, with churches and schools and cemeteries, and children who walked to class, and men who owned their land, and women who grew gardens. A neighborhood that was here for 32 years, before they decided they needed it for something else. Its name was Seneca Village, and before they tore it down, they had to do one thing first. They had to convince everyone that it was never really there. His name was Andrew Williams. He was 25 years old. He worked as a bootblack. He shined other people's shoes for a living. On September 27, 1825, he bought 3 lots of land in Upper Manhattan for $125. 3 lots. In a city where black men were not supposed to own anything. In a city where, only 2 years earlier, slavery had still been legal in the state of New York. He planted a stake in the ground. He didn't know what he had started. By 1855, Seneca Village had 50 homes, 3 churches, 2 schools, 3 cemeteries, a spring called Tanner's Spring for clean water, gardens, livestock, fishing in the Hudson River, 225 residents, 2/3 black, 1/3 Irish, a few German families, in a city full of racial hatred and overcrowded slums downtown. Seneca Village was something that should not have been possible. A free black community, thriving, putting down roots, building for the future. More than half of the black residents owned their own land. That number sounds ordinary. It wasn't. The citywide rate of property ownership for all New Yorkers, white, black, Irish, everyone, was 1 in 5. In Seneca Village, among black residents specifically, it was 1 in 2, 5 times the average. And property ownership mattered for a reason that went beyond money. Under New York State law at the time, to qualify to vote, a black man had to own at least $250 worth of property. Seneca Village was not just a neighborhood, it was political power. Real, documented, legal political power in a city that did not want black people to have any. And this is where it breaks. Because when the city decided it needed the land, the first thing they did was attack the vote. In 1853, the New York State Legislature passed the Central Park Act, 750 acres in the middle of Manhattan, a great park for the city, a park to rival London and Paris, a civilizing achievement. Seneca Village sat in the middle of it. The city had a legal tool called eminent domain, the power to seize private land for public use. With compensation, they used it. But before they used it, before they sent the police, before the demolition crews arrived, something else happened. The newspapers began to print a different story about Seneca Village, not the story of Andrew Williams, buying 3 lots for $125 and building a community. A different story. Seneca Village was a shanty town. Its residents were squatters. They were vagabonds. They were scoundrels. They were stubborn insects. One engineer hired to survey the land, Egbert Ludovicus Vielle, described the area as home to 5,000 squatters with very little knowledge of the English language and very little respect for the law. Seneca Village had 225 residents, not 5,000, and many of them had been there longer than Vielle had been alive. The New York Daily Times wrote that the residents were possessed of simple minds who could not understand why the city needed their homes. The newspaper that called them simple-minded had not asked them. It had not sent a reporter to walk the streets of Seneca Village and count the 2-story houses built on stone foundations. It had not noticed the church whose cornerstone had just been laid, the same year the Central Park Act passed. It had not mentioned that the people being called squatters owned the land they were being called squatters on. Here is the part that I cannot get out of my head. The residents of Seneca Village fought back. For 2 years, they filed lawsuits, they petitioned the courts, they organized, they resisted. Some of them refused to leave. When the eviction orders came in 1856, those who stayed were beaten by police. A newspaper reported the event this way: "The supremacy of the law was upheld by the policemen's bludgeons." That is how it was described: a triumph of order, a necessary enforcement, the law doing its job. The people being beaten by clubs were not described as people being beaten by clubs. They were described as an obstacle that had been removed. By October 1, 1857, the last residents were gone. By 1858, the buildings had been demolished. And then, this is the part that matters most, the story disappeared. Not the park. The park was built. Millions of people came. Frederick Law Olmsted was celebrated. Calvert Vaux was celebrated. The triumph of civic vision was celebrated. The neighborhood underneath it was not mentioned again for 135 years. But I need you to understand what was found when archaeologists finally looked. In 1992, two historians named Roy Rosenzweig and Elizabeth Blackmar published a book called The Park and the People. It was the first time Seneca Village appeared in any serious historical record since 1857. 135 years. In 2004, archaeologists began excavating the site of Seneca Village inside Central Park. They came back in 2005 and again in 2011. What they found was not a shantytown. They found stone foundation walls, the foundations of two-story houses built to last. They found beef bones and dishes. They found buttons and bottles. They found a toothbrush. And they found the sole of a child's shoe. A single leather sole from a child's shoe. Small, worn through on one side, the shoe of a child who walked on this ground before it was a park, who went to school here, who had a name, and no one knows that name. Because here is the thing about Seneca Village that the newspapers made sure of. No photographs survived. No personal papers survived. No letters. No diaries. No first-hand accounts from any of the 225 residents. Historians searched for decades. In the 20th century, not one living descendant had been identified. In a city that kept meticulous records of everything: births, deaths, property transfers, tax assessments, police reports, the interior lives of the people of Seneca Village were not considered worth keeping. What we know about them comes from census records, from property deeds, from tax filings, numbers and categories, not stories, because they made sure there would be no stories. But one name survived, and what happened to that name tells you everything. Andrew Williams, the 25-year-old bootblack who bought the first 3 lots in September 1825, when the city acquired his property through eminent domain in 1856. They paid him $2,335. He had asked for $3,500. He had built a house. He had lived there for 31 years. He had been one of the founding members of the community. He received 67 cents on the dollar for everything he had built. And then, like everyone else, he disappeared from the record. No one knows where Andrew Williams went after October 1857, not immediately after, not 5 years later, not at all. The man who started it was absorbed by the city that took everything from him and left no trace until 2019. In 2019, a family genealogist named Ariel Williams discovered she was a descendant of Andrew Williams. She had been living in New York City, the city built on top of the neighborhood her ancestor founded was the city she lived in. She had walked through Central Park, not knowing. When the Central Park Conservancy found her, she stood at the site of Seneca Village for the first time, knowing what she was standing on. She said something then that I have thought about since I first read it. She said she felt like she owed it to her ancestors to know their story, not to perform grief, not to make a political statement, just to know that Andrew Williams was a real person who bought 3 lots for $125 and built something in a city that did not want him to, and that what he built was real, even though the city that took it from him spent 160 years making sure as few people as possible would ever know. Every year, the Central Park Conservancy leads tours of the Seneca Village site. You can stand there at West 85th Street, at the edge of what was once a neighborhood. If you know where to look, you can see the stone foundations still embedded in the grass, the cobblestones that visitors step over every day, not knowing what they are. The archaeologists also found something else. In the 2011 excavation, 2 graves and a burial plot. People buried on this land before 1857. People who were laid to rest in a community cemetery, one of 3 that Seneca Village had, and then covered by 16 million square feet of public parkland. There are people buried under Central Park, and their descendants do not know where, because after the eviction, the cemeteries were not preserved, the bodies were not moved to a named location, the markers were not kept. They are somewhere beneath the grass that 42 million people walk across every year. In 2001, 144 years after the last resident was removed, a historical marker was placed at the Seneca Village site. A small sign, in a 843-acre park, explaining what used to be here. The sign is still there. So is Andrew Williams' great-great-great-granddaughter. And so, somewhere beneath the lawns of Central Park are the people who were buried here before they decided this place was needed for something else. I am not telling you what to conclude, but I am asking you one thing. The next time you walk through Central Park, the next time you spread a blanket on that grass and look up at the sky, think about what they had to do to the people who lived here before they could build you somewhere to relax. They had to take their homes, they had to take their churches, they had to take their cemeteries, and then they had to take one more thing. They had to take the story, because a place that no one remembers is a place that no one can ask for back.